diving deep into an international dispute you might not have heard much about. It's the battle over the Chagos Islands. And we've got a whole stack of reports and legal opinions to wade through. This one is going to be complicated.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these islands, I mean, they're just a tiny speck in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
But they've become a major point of contention. You've got nation squabbling, it touches on colonialism and international law, even military strategy.
Yeah, from what I've gathered, these islands are currently a British overseas territory, right? And there's a joint UK-US naval base there, Diego Garcia, which seems to be kind of at the heart of all this.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That base is key. But to really understand what's going on, I need to go back a bit. Mauritius claims sovereignty over the Chagos Islands. They say they were separated from their territory unfairly, back when the UK was, building its empire. And this isn't just some historical footnote. This is a live legal fight. In 2019, the International Court of Justice, you could think of that as the highest court for nations. Well, they issued an advisory ruling saying that the UK's administration of the Chagos Islands is illegal.
Hold on, advisory ruling? What does that even mean? Does it actually force the UK to do anything?
That's a really good question. It kind of gets to the heart of how international law works. So an advisory ruling isn't legally binding, not in the same way a regular court judgment would be. But it carries a lot of weight.
Yeah.
It's basically telling the world, hey, the UK's claim to these islands is shaky, and that it violates international norms, and to make things even tougher for the UK. The UN General Assembly backed up the ICJ. They voted overwhelmingly to demand the UK withdraw from the island.
Okay, so you've got this legal and diplomatic pressure building on the UK, but they still control the islands. And that base is super important, especially for the US. So what happens next?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The UK has announced plans to hand over sovereignty of the islands to Mauritius. It seems like they're bowing to international pressure. But there's a catch. They want to keep control of Diego Garcia through a 99-year lease.
A 99-year lease? That seems like a pretty long time. Are they hoping the whole thing will just blow over by then?
It does raise questions about how committed they are to really giving up control. And this proposed solution definitely hasn't pleased everyone, especially not U.S. Senator John Kennedy. Let's just say he did not hold back.
Yes, Senator Kennedy, a man known for his colorful language. From what I've read, he was not too happy with the UK's decision, especially with the potential change in who controls Diego Garcia.
To put it mildly, he actually suggested that Prime Minister Keir Starmer must be on drugs to even consider giving up that base. He even used phrases like, put down the bomb.
Wow, that's quite the statement. It sounds like he feels pretty strongly about this. Is that just a personal opinion? Or does it reflect wider concerns within the U.S. government?
It's hard to say for sure. But Kennedy's outburst definitely tapped into a pre-existing unease, within certain U.S. circles. Remember, former President Trump was also against the handover, and the new Secretary of State Marco Rubio hasn't said anything about where he stands. I think it's safe to say the U.S. sees Diego Garcia as a vital strategic asset. Any changes to its status will be scrutinized.
So you've got the International Court of Justice, you've got the UN, a U.S. senator with some very strong opinions, and a UK prime minister stuck in the middle, trying to balance international pressure with strategic interests. This is already a pretty tangled web.
And we haven't even gotten to the money yet. That's where things get even more complicated.
Oh, there's money involved too. Now I'm really interested.
The UK has reportedly agreed to pay Mauritius a significant sum. We're talking $90 million annually for the duration of that 99-year lease, totaling a whopping £9 billion. But the Mauritian Prime Minister, Navin Ramgoolam, he's thrown another wrench in things. He says the UK might actually end up paying double that amount because of inflation adjustments, potentially pushing the total to £18 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of money. Guess the cost of international diplomacy can really add up. But hold on a second. A 99-year lease, A&D, billions of pounds.
It feels like the UK is trying to have its cake and eat it too, like they're holding on to the base, while appearing to concede to international pressure.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, Downing Street sources have disputed Ramgoolam's calculation. They say it's not that straightforward. Amidst all this back and forth, Starmer spokesperson's been pretty tight-lipped. They're refusing to comment on the specifics of the negotiations. But they emphasize the need to ensure the UK's national security. And they say that any final treaty will be presented to Parliament for scrutiny and ratification. So we've got competing claims to sovereignty, a strategically important naval base, a U.S. senator using some very interesting language, and now a hefty financial agreement that's being disputed. It sounds like a high-stakes game of chess is playing out on these tiny islands. What does all this mean for the people actually living there, the Chagosians?
That's a crucial part of this story, one that often gets overlooked. The history of the Chagosian people is deeply intertwined with this dispute. Their perspective is essential to understanding the human cost of these geopolitical maneuvers. It's a tragic story. In the 60s and 70s, they were forcibly removed from their homes by the British government to make way for that Diego Garcia base. Many of them ended up in Mauritius and Seychelles, living in poverty, facing discrimination. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of colonialism and the brutal realities behind these strategic decisions.
It's heartbreaking. Families uprooted and scattered. And for what? So they could build a military base. It's like they were pawns in a bigger game.
That's exactly how many Chagosians and their advocates feel. They argue that their removal was a violation of their human rights, and they've been fighting for their right to return for decades.
Have there been any attempts to address this injustice? I mean, if the UK is handing over the islands to Mauritius, wouldn't that open the door for the Chagosians to come home?
It's not that simple, unfortunately. The handover doesn't automatically guarantee their right of return. That's a separate issue, one that needs to be negotiated. Between the UK, Mauritius, and representatives of the Chagosian community, there are concerns about the feasibility of resettling, the potential impact on the environment, and of course, the strategic interests surrounding Diego Garcia.
So even if the sovereignty issue is resolved, the fate of the Chagosian people is still up in the air. It's a reminder that these international disputes often have a human dimension. That goes way beyond legal arguments and political maneuvering.
Absolutely. The Chagosians have become a symbol of the lasting legacy of colonialism, their struggle for recognition, justice, and repatriation. It adds another layer to this already complicated situation.
This whole situation raises so many questions. For example, let's say the UK hands over the islands, but keeps control of the base through that 99-year lease. What happens if down the line, Mauritius decides they want the base back? Could they legally challenge that lease?
That's the million-dollar question. It comes down to how these international agreements are interpreted and enforced. The terms of the lease agreement will be crucial. It'll determine the rights and obligations of both sides. It's likely the UK will try to lock in a lease, one that guarantees their access to the base, for the full 99 years. But international law is always evolving, so there's always a chance for future legal challenges.
So even with an agreement in place, there's still a lot of uncertainty. It makes you wonder what impact this could have on other territorial disputes around the world. Could this set a precedent for other countries to challenge existing agreements or to try and reclaim territory they believe was unjustly taken?
It's definitely a possibility. The outcome of the Chagos Islands dispute could have ripple effects. It might embolden other nations to pursue their own claims, especially claims rooted in historical injustices. It could also change how we understand colonial legacies and how they still shape international relations today.
Sounds like we could be entering a period of instability, with more and more countries willing to push back against unfair arrangements.
It's a scenario worth considering. The Chagos Islands dispute highlights how power dynamics are shifting. Nations that were once on the sidelines of global decision-making are becoming more assertive. The old colonial order is being challenged, and the outcome of these disputes will shape international relations for years to come.
Speaking of shifting power dynamics, let's talk about the U.S. for a moment. We've heard Senator Kennedy's colorful opinions, but what are the broader implications for the U.S.? Diego Garcia is clearly important to them strategically. But if they lose access, what are their options?
That base is a cornerstone of U.S. military strategy, at least in the Indian Ocean. It allows them to project power, conduct surveillance, support operations across a huge region. Losing access would be a big blow. They'd have to rethink their entire military posture and their strategic partnerships.
So what would that look like in reality? Would they have to scramble to find new bases, potentially creating tension with other countries?
Exactly. They might have to look for alternative basing arrangements, possibly in countries with less stable political systems, or locations that aren't as strategically advantageous. This could lead to more diplomatic friction and make it harder for the U.S. to counter the influence of rivals, like China.
Seems like the U.S. has a lot riding on the outcome here. Do you think they'll intervene more directly, maybe try to influence the negotiations, or even pressure the UK to reconsider the handover?
It's definitely possible they'll try to exert their influence behind the scenes. They've been involved in the region for a long time, and they have a vested interest in maintaining their military presence. But being too overt carries risks. It could alienate Mauritius and hurt the U.S.'s reputation internationally.
It's a tough balancing act for them. They have to weigh their strategic interests. against the potential diplomatic fallout and the risk of being seen as meddling.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of soft power comes in. The U.S. might try to use its economic and diplomatic clout to persuade Mauritius to cooperate, maybe offer incentives or guarantees in exchange for continued access to Diego Garcia.
So it's not just about military might anymore. It's about using diplomacy, economic influence, and strategic partnerships to get what you want.
You got it. In today's world, hard power alone isn't enough. You need to understand the nuances of regional dynamics, cultural sensitivities, and the complexities of international law to navigate these types of disputes effectively.
This all sounds incredibly complex, and there are clearly no easy solutions. What do you see as the most likely outcome here of this whole Chagos Islands saga?
Predicting the future of international relations is a tough job. There are just too many variables, and things can change so quickly. But based on what we've talked about so far, I think there are a few possible scenarios.
All right, so let's game out some of those scenarios. What do you think is the most likely outcome here?
Well, in my view, the most likely outcome is a negotiated settlement, some sort of compromise, something that tries to satisfy all the main players, at least to some degree. So the UK might go ahead with the handover of sovereignty to Mauritius, but with a very carefully worded lease agreement, one that guarantees the US can still access Diego Garcia for a long time, maybe even longer than those initial 99 years.
So a bit of a balancing act, trying to keep everyone happy. But wouldn't that leave the Chagosians in a tough spot? Where do they fit into this compromise?
That's the big question, and it's going to be a source of tension for sure. The UK might offer some concessions, maybe limited resettlement on some of the islands, or some kind of financial compensation, but I doubt they'll fully agree to let everyone return, especially if it clashes with the US wanting to keep a secure military presence.
So even in the best case scenario, there are going to be winners and losers, and the Chagosians might end up getting the short end of the stick. Are there any other possibilities, maybe some not so optimistic scenarios we should think about?
Definitely. One possibility is that the negotiations just fall apart. Like if Mauritius pushes too hard for a full return of the Chagosians, or if the U.S. refuses to budge on security guarantees, or if the U.K. gets cold feet about the handover, maybe because of political pressure at home. That kind of impasse could lead to more legal battles, more appeals to international courts, and just a lot more tension diplomatically.
And I imagine that wouldn't be good for anyone, especially not for stability in the region.
You're right. A drawn-out standoff wouldn't benefit anyone, least of all the Chagosian people. They'd be caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war. And then there's always the wild card factor, some unforeseen event, something that could completely change the game.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, imagine a sudden shift in global power. Maybe a major conflict breaks out somewhere else, and that sucks up everyone's attention and resources. Or maybe there's some new technology that makes Diego Garcia strategically irrelevant. Any of those things could change the stakes completely and force everyone to rethink their priorities.
It's a reminder that things can change really fast. So given all these uncertainties, what advice would you give to someone like me, or even our listeners, who are trying to understand this whole situation?
I think the most important thing is to approach this with a critical eye. And that goes for any international dispute. Don't just accept the official story or what those in power are telling you. Dig deeper. Look for different perspectives. Question your assumptions. And think about the long-term consequences.
That's good advice for life in general, not just international relations. Be curious, be skeptical, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
Exactly. And remember, even a dispute that seems far away, like this one, can have ripple effects that touch all our lives. The Chagos Islands dispute is about more than just territory and military bases. It's about justice, human rights, the legacy of colonialism. It's a microcosm of the challenges we face in trying to build a better world, a more just and sustainable world order.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. We started with a stack of reports, and through our conversation, we've uncovered a story full of intrigue, injustice, and uncertainty. We've looked at the history of this dispute, we've explored the legal and strategic complexities, and we've thought about what it all means for the future.
And we've highlighted the human side of it all, reminding ourselves that behind all the legal arguments and the geopolitical maneuvering are real people whose lives have been deeply affected by the decisions of powerful nations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
I'd say this. The Chagos Islands dispute is a reminder that the world is interconnected. What we do has consequences that reach far beyond our own borders. It's a call to action. engage with the world, challenge injustice, and fight for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Powerful words to end on. To our listeners, keep exploring this topic, stay informed, and engage in thoughtful discussions about the challenges facing our world. And remember, there's always more to uncover, more perspectives to consider, and more deep dives to take.